Segment 10A, Introduction. It was the end of the Roman Republic as they knew it, but nobody felt fine. War after war, political maneuver after political maneuver, scandal after scandal. The Republic was destined to burn out rather than fade away. The question was, how would Romans know for sure when the Republic was dead? And what would they find to replace it? In segment 10B, Life During Wartime, Rome refused to grant citizenship to all her Italian allies, thereby tipping off the utterly avoidable social war of 91 through 88 BC. Rome's first real civil war would have lasted longer were it not for the murder of 80,000 Roman nationals in 88 BC, which took place on one night. There was no question that Rome had to deal with the instigator, one King Mithridates of Pontus. But first, Marius and Sulla had to fight it out for the privilege of fighting Mithridates. In 87 BC, Sulla was the first general to march his client army upon Rome. Marius fled, but once Sulla left to fight Mithridates, he came back and started his own reign of terror with his own client army. You get the picture. The era was also marked by blanket grants of multi-year proconsular imperium, which was needed to wipe out legitimate threats such as Spartacus or the pirates, but was also a breeding ground for the development of dangerous client armies. Segment 10C, the First Triumvirate, covers the last full decade of the Roman Republic, from 60 BC to 50 BC, when the Roman world was dominated by three men: Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar. The so-called First Triumvirate was not a legal or even formal arrangement, merely an agreement that Rome's three most powerful men would help look out after each other's best interests. The Senate, and especially the Optimates, could only sit and watch and try not to get killed walking out in the streets. Caesar got to raise a client army, which he used to conquer all Gaul. Pompey got a lucrative command in Spain. And Crassus got himself killed trying to conquer Parthia. Once the triumvirate had shrunk to two men, it became possible for the Senate and the Optimates to win Pompey over and provoke a civil war with Julius Caesar. In segment 10D, Fall of the Roman Republic falls. Caesar killed it by defeating Pompey in 48 BC. After 2 years of mopping up resistance, Caesar confronted the question of how he should reorganize the Roman state. For the first time in his life, it seemed that Caesar had run out of ideas. It seemed as though he was trying to establish himself as king of Rome. Even though the old republic had clearly failed, some senators led by Marcus Junius Brutus decided, hey, it was worth another try, and that Caesar had to go. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, Caesar was turned into a human pincushion. The assassins thought they would seize power and make everything wonderful, while Caesar's right-hand man and dear friend Mark Antony thought he would take over the Caesar family operation. Meanwhile, an 18-year-old kid studying in Greece named Gaius Octavius finds out that his late uncle Julius has adopted him in his will, and that his new name is Julius Caesar Jr., and that he is the heir to Caesar's legacy. Segment 10B, Life During Wartime. The Roman Republic began the 1st century BC with a severe constitutional conflict. During his multiple consulships, Marius and his client army had saved Rome from Germanic tribes. Now he was back in Rome, working with the populares to win benefits for his client's soldiers. Although Marius retired from the scene in 100 BC, Rome's next 7 decades would be marked by bloody, multiple civil wars. In 91 BC, Rome's unwillingness to share full Roman citizenship with its Italian allies started the Social War. Marius, Sulla, and other Roman generals found themselves fighting their former Italian comrades, now organized as the State of Italia. The Social War ended abruptly and peacefully due to an even bigger problem in the east. In 88 BC, King Mithridates VI of Pontus, in modern-day Turkey, convinced the people of the Roman province of Asia to revolt. Given the Romans' brutal exploitations of its provincials, this was not a tough argument. Mithridates' first step was a bold terrorist act, the murder of a reported 80,000 Romans, including Roman families, Italians, and slaves, in one night. The fact that Mithridates' plot was not apprehended or stopped shows just how hated the Romans had made themselves. As the rebellion spread across the Aegean Sea to Greece, it dawned on the Romans that maybe the Italian allies deserved full citizenship after all. A hurried peace was made, and Rome prepared to punish Mithridates. The end of the Social War exposed a fatal flaw in the Roman Republic. What happened when two legislative bodies disagreed with each other? The popular assembly was summoned by a popularis tribune. It awarded the command against Mithridates to the beloved Gaius Marius. Marius was happy to accept. He and his veterans had warmed up in the Social War, and they were ready to go. For its part, the senatorial optimates chose one of the consuls for 87 BC, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician and once Marius's trusted lieutenant. Like Marius, Sulla had been commanding a client army in the Social War. Sulla and his veterans were also warmed up and ready to go. But the war versus Mithridates was not big enough for both Marius and Sulla. Sulla and his army struck first and slaughtered Marius's supporters. For the first time, but not for the last, Roman troops under Sulla marched on Rome. Marius himself hid out until Sulla and his troops left to fight Mithridates. He then marched on Rome with his troops and threw a little bloodbath of his own. Marius was also elected consul an unprecedented 7th time, but died, fortunately, before he could harm the state any further. His supporters, though, maintained their stranglehold on Roman government, even sending a separate army to Asia with orders to defeat Sulla and Mithridates in that order. These soldiers wisely defected to Sulla at their earliest opportunity. Sulla thought he had to fix Rome's problems first. He therefore made a peace treaty with Mithridates, returned to Italy with his army, marched on Rome again, and wiped out Marius's supporters a second time. This accomplished by 81 BC, Sulla declared himself dictator for the quote-unquote restoration of the Republic. His first step was to condemn his popularis enemies and confiscate all their property. The Senate asked Sulla to publish the names of the condemned, so that those not on the list could be freed from anxiety, a process called proscription, or posting of names. Although his reign of terror was just as bloody as that of the hated Marius, Sulla tried hard to fix what he saw as the Roman Republic's problems. Sulla strengthened the Senate's power and legally established the minimum ages for holding Roman magistracies. He weakened the tribunate by making ex-tribunes ineligible for future magistracies, and he quit giving grain to the urban masses for free. His goal was to ensure that no Marius, or no Sulla for that matter, would ever threaten Rome again. He decreed that no standing army could be stationed in or near Rome, and that governors or commanders could not lead troops back anywhere near Rome without the express permission of the Senate. This accomplished, Sulla laid down his dictatorship and partied himself to death in 79 BC. Yet the problem presented by client armies would not go away. Rome had already endured 3 civil wars: the Social War, 91 through 88 BC, Sulla's War of 87 BC, and Sulla's Second War of 82 to 81 BC. The general Quintus Sertorius, a comrade of Marius, took over the provinces of Spain and held out until 72 BC, when he was at last suppressed by the young general Pompey. The Spartacus slave revolt of 73 to 71 BC was put down by the sullen general Crassus, with an assist from Pompey and his Spanish veterans. Crassus never forgave Pompey for stealing his limelight. To reward these ambitious young generals and hopefully keep them from marching their client armies upon Rome, Pompey and Crassus were elected co-consuls for 70 BC. This was yet another lousy precedent. Pompey was not only too young to be the consul, he had never been elected to any position on the cursus honorum. But Rome was now an empire in the full sense of the word, and war was no longer a matter of dropping the plow, picking up the sword, and kicking Etruscan tail. Now, Rome needed professional armies and experienced generals to fight its wars. These generals had to be kept happy. And nothing made a general happier than a long-term grant of proconsular imperium, a great big blank check to fight Rome's enemies just as one wanted to. In 67 BC, young Pompey, who now called himself Gnaeus Pompey the Great, received a 5-year grant of proconsular imperium to rid the Mediterranean of pirates. It took him 9 months. In the next year, another law gave Pompey proconsular imperium to defeat King Mithridates of Pontus once and for all, finishing the work Sulla had left behind. And this Pompey had accomplished by December 62 BC. So far, Pompey had not abused either of his grants of proconsular imperium. All Rome still awaited his return with great anxiety. Rome had already endured another minor civil war in 63 BC when the Popularis Catiline was caught plotting to overthrow the state. Catiline's backers were Crassus and Marius's ambitious but impoverished nephew, the Pontifex Maximus Julius Caesar. The mighty mouth of the consul Cicero was enough to put Catiline out of commission. But Crassus and Caesar remained free, hoping to gain leverage against their joint adversary Pompey. As far as the Senate was concerned, all of the potential Sullas needed to be put on the sideline, especially Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar. The great Roman powder keg was about to blow sky high. Segment 10C, the first triumvirate. The cursus honorum, as it had evolved at first, worked just fine, even for a city-state which had absorbed all of Italy. Even Scipio Africanus, conqueror of Hannibal and darling of the Roman masses, had been content to fade into the woodwork once his job was done. No Roman was greater than the Roman state, and the Gracchi had learned the hard way not to stick one's neck out against the Senate. Even Sulla, murderous thug that he was, tried to ensure there would be no more warlords like him. By increasing the Senate's power, he thought he would save the Roman Republic yet. But those were different times. Rome was now too big, too wealthy, too powerful to be effectively run by annual magistrates running under the overall control of the Roman Senate. Defending the Roman world now required powers far greater than the mos maiorum had been comfortable in granting just one man. Victory over King Mithridates of Pontus had required a 5-year grant of proconsular imperium to Pompey. Only then could Pompey defeat Mithridates, reorganize Rome's new Near Eastern territories, and establish a belt of buffer states between the Roman Empire and Parthia. None of this would have been possible for a general constantly asking the Senate for permission. Pompey did indeed lay his imperium down on returning to Rome. In 61 BC, he held a triumph and dismissed his troops. But like Marius before him, he wanted the Senate to ratify these political arrangements and to give land to his faithful client soldiers. The Senate, trying to hang on to a scrap of its former prestige, refused. Crassus had become Rome's wealthiest man during Sulla's reign of terror by buying very cheaply property of proscribed Romans. Crassus did most of the work in putting down Spartacus's rebellion, only to have Pompey show up in time to claim the credit. After serving with Pompey as consul for 70 BC, Crassus looked to his financial affairs. In the Senate, he was the patron for the publicani, or tax collectors. Because Pompey had extracted so much money from the east during his smashing victories, the publicani had fallen on tough times. They wanted to renegotiate what they'd promised to pay the Senate, but the Senate refused. Gaius Julius Caesar was a dirt-poor politician, further handicapped by being the nephew of Marius's wife. But Julius had mad political skills, which he displayed in getting elected Pontifex Maximus. From that important office, Julius Caesar did the groundwork for winning the consulship of 59 BC. He reached out to Pompey and to Crassus and promised to help them get what they wanted from the Senate, provided they helped him get the consulship, and a nice long grant of proconsular imperium in Gaul to follow his consulship. The arrangement Caesar made between Pompey, Crassus, and himself is best known now as the First Triumvirate, even though it was not a legal entity like the Second Triumvirate truly was. The three triumvirs had hoped to bring the silver-tongued Cicero in to make it a foursome. But to his credit, Cicero could not be conned into joining. As planned, Caesar was elected one of the consuls of 59 BC, along with an unfortunate fellow by the name of Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus. That year, Caesar did his utmost, legally, illegally, to pass the legislation Pompey and Crassus wanted. Anyone in Caesar's way found himself on the receiving end of a beating from Pompey's burly veterans. His tactics were so heavy-handed that Bibulus just stayed home all year, claiming that he was watching the skies. This meant that he was collecting bizarre religious portents to help him invalidate Caesar's legislation after the year was over. Roman humorists called that year not the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus, but the consulship of Julius and Caesar. Pompey got his official attaboy for beating Mithridates. His client soldiers got land. Crassus's tax collector buddies got to renegotiate their contracts on more favorable terms. Caesar himself received 5 years of proconsular imperium in Rome's 2 Gallic provinces. Building a client army of 30,000 men, Caesar conquered and pacified almost the entire area of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, along with coastal areas of Britain. To ensure that everyone back home knew about his great achievements, Caesar published a series of commentaries, or books about his Gallic Wars, a Roman public relations first. While the members of the Senate's aristocratic faction, or optimates, seethed, the minions of the so-called First Triumvirate maintained their stranglehold on Roman politics. Predictably, friction arose between Pompey and Crassus, but Caesar held the deal together in 55 BC by renewing the agreement. Pompey got proconsular imperium in Spain, and Crassus got proconsular imperium in the east. Pompey had been there and done that, decided to stay home in Rome and rule Spain through his lieutenants. Beating Mithridates was a hard act to top. But Crassus yearned to match Caesar's and Pompey's successes. He unwisely picked a fight with the Parthian Empire and was killed in 53 BC. Now that the triumvirate was down to two people, the senatorial optimates began to pit Pompey against Caesar. For Caesar, it was essential to be elected consul for 49 BC. It would give him a year's worth of time to settle old accounts with the senatorial optimates and their new pal Pompey. But the Mos Maiorum dictated that Caesar would have to lay down his proconsular imperium, enter Rome as a private citizen, and only then campaign for himself. But the instant Caesar set foot in Rome without his imperium or his troops, he knew he'd be dragged into court over and over again until his political career was a ruin. And this was, of course, precisely what the Senate was hoping for. It commanded Caesar to abandon his Gallic command and come back home as a private citizen by himself. Instead, January 49th, Caesar brought down his legions from Gaul, crossed the Rubicon River, and started the civil war of 48 to 46 BC. Segment 10D, Fall of the Roman Republic. Late in 50 BC, the Senate ordered Caesar to arrive in Rome, minus his proconsular imperium and minus his client army. Civil war was Caesar's only viable option. Aware that outside of a few senatorial diehards, nobody actually wanted this war, he wanted to limit the collateral damage to the Roman state. Despite dire rumors of upcoming proscriptions and other assorted nastiness, Caesar announced that any combatant surrendering to him could return home unharmed. This policy of clementia, or clemency, allowed many Pompeian supporters to escape. But it also won Caesar a great deal of popular support. Most Romans really did just want to be left alone. Caesar also worked to pretend he was not a warlord at the head of a client army. He was just seeking a peaceful solution to Rome's political problems. Even so, he worked very quickly. Pompey was beaten at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC. In 47 BC, Cleopatra was established as Queen of ancient Egypt, and King Pharnabazus of Pontus was overthrown in 47 BC. The last nest of optimates was cleared out of Africa in 46 BC. Returning to Rome in July 46, Caesar celebrated 4 triumphs: Gaul, Egypt, Asia, and Africa, but none over Pompey. He assumed a 10-year dictatorship, like Sulla, for the purpose of restoring the Republic. At this point, Caesar still appeared serious about maintaining the old Republican political institutions. He helped campaign for magistrates and encouraged young nobles such as young Marcus Junius Brutus to consider careers in public affairs. But in 45 BC, Pompey's two surviving sons stirred up a Spanish rebellion, forcing Caesar to go there and stamp the rebellion out. It's likely the experience led Caesar to think that the Republic really couldn't be fixed. If Caesar's old enemies were bound and determined to get back at him, there was no point in his pretending to share power with anyone else. On his return from Spain, Caesar was a different man. He now worked hard to secure his supreme authority in the Roman state. The popular assembly, which had always been on his side, piled honor after honor on him, such as the right to use the title Imperator as his first name, lifetime tribunician power complete with veto, and the establishment of a formal religious cult around his genius or guardian spirit. Caesar packed the Senate with his supporters, doubling it in size, and he rigged the annual elections for 5 years in advance. His excuse for this breach of the mos maiorum was his planned campaign against the Parthian Empire, finishing the job that Crassus had so ineptly begun. He expected to be gone for a while, and he had to make sure that Rome would remain secure in his absence. Early in 44 BC, coinage appeared portraying Caesar as dictator for life. At the Lupercalia festival in mid-February, Mark Antony suddenly appeared with the crown which he tried to put on Caesar's head. Sensing a bad vibe, Caesar refused the offer, but at least he seemed interested in being the real king of Rome. The few remaining optimates certainly saw it that way. And if that wasn't bad enough, Caesar's mistress, Queen Cleopatra of ancient Egypt, moved into Caesar's house, along with their infant son, Caesarion, or Little Caesar. It seemed as though Caesar was laughing not only at the state, but at the entire mos maiorum. On the eve of his Parthian campaign, Caesar attended a Senate meeting called for the Ides of March, 44 BC. It was in the theater of Pompey, because the Senate house was still being rebuilt. On that day, March 15th, 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated by a group of 67 senators, including some, such as the noble Brutus and the lean and hungry Cassius, whom he had personally forgiven their service with Pompey. These so-called Republicans believed that they were striking a noble blow for truth, justice, and the mos maiorum. Unfortunately, they had no constructive ideas for saving the Roman Republic after killing Caesar. Whatever Caesar's ultimate intentions were, he made a fatal error in even seeming to be interested in restoring the monarchy. Maybe Caesar thought he'd never be able to fix the republic as he saw fit. Maybe he thought enlightened monarchy was the only possible solution. As we'll see in the next unit, this turned out to be the case. Or perhaps Caesar was not acting of his free will, pushed instead towards monarchy by followers like Mark Antony and Queen Cleopatra of ancient Egypt, who hoped to profit from their connections with the king of Rome. Or maybe the kingship had always been his goal from his impoverished aristocratic youth. Even though Caesar was undoubtedly the greatest man of the Roman Republic's last years, he was not great enough to solve Rome's political problems. It didn't look like anyone else was great enough either. On the one side was the Caesarian faction, headed by the late great Julius's comrade-in-arms / boon companion, Mark Antony. On the other side were the senatorial optimates, allied with the assassins of Caesar, or the so-called Republicans, led by the silver-tongued old statesman Cicero. It looked like yet another worldwide civil war was on tap, complete with marches upon Rome and new lists of proscriptions. Nobody seemed to notice that Caesar's will had actually listed as heir and adopted son his 18-year-old grandnephew, one Gaius Octavius. Young Gaius's mother advised him to stay back in Greece and keep studying his philosophy and avoid getting killed. But nobody, as it turned out, told Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus what to do. Within half a year, young Octavian Caesar had formed the second triumvirate with Mark Antony and a nitwit named Lepidus. Within 2 years, by 42 BC, the assassins and the senatorial faction had been defeated for good. And by 31 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, or Octavian as he's better known, was master of the entire Roman world, and free at last to begin really solving Rome's political problems. And then, my friend, you die. That's it. Segment 10E, Conclusions. 1. Reigns of Terror. In its last century, the Roman Republic experienced terrorism, organized and unorganized, from without and within. King Mithridates' murder in 88 BC of 80,000 Romans in the province of Asia ended one civil war, the Social War, and set off another one between Sulla and Marius to see which of them would lead the Roman army. Sulla's victory in the civil war that he fought on returning to Italy was followed by the mass murder of wealthy citizens, the so-called proscriptions, and a 3-year dictatorship. During the time of the first triumvirate, rival gangs roamed the streets of Rome, sometimes in the pay of politicians, and sometimes they were just freelancing. Even the triumvir Pompey himself had to stay home sometimes, and this in a time of supposed peace. When Caesar and Pompey began their civil war in 49 BC, Romans could be excused for expecting it to get nasty. But Caesar's remarkable policy of clementia, or clemency, limited the collateral damage. Rome, however, was not out of the woods just yet. Caesar's death in 44 led to yet more public suffering. It would take a rare leader indeed to extract Rome from this mess. Two, men versus society. Since the first Western historians were affluent, upper-class males, Western history has all too often been fixated on the military and political antics of affluent, upper-class males. No argument there. The Roman Republic was constructed in a way that restricted effective political power to wealthy citizen males. And in its dying years, it was controlled by a very small circle of wealthy citizen males. Then it was controlled by 3 wealthy citizen males, and ultimately by 1 wealthy citizen male named Julius Caesar. Yet the interplay of the first triumvirate at the end of the Roman Republic is crucial to understanding its demise. Their flaws in their personalities set off the virtues of the Principate which followed. The personal interactions of wealthy and influential Romans, even on the family level, could cause political shockwaves. For instance, Pompey was the very loving husband of Caesar's daughter Julia. The marriage was arranged as part of the first triumvirate, but when she died giving birth to a stillborn child, her untimely death led to a split between Pompey and Caesar. When stuff like this affects public policy, when stuff like this affects the state's security, democracy, is definitely broken. And here's a laundry list of the external signs of a broken government, which you can use as you will on an essay exam. I don't know how much more blatant I can be. 1. The old cursus honorum was great for running a large city-state, as Rome once was. It was great for running a small empire, which Rome once was. It was not a good way of administering the entire Mediterranean world. The flexibility Rome had demonstrated during the conflict of the orders was sadly lacking. 2. The small farmer class, backbone of the Roman state and of the Roman volunteer army, had either been killed off during centuries of warfare or put out of business by the latifundia. The result was the growth of an urban mob at Rome. 3. The penalty for attempting to restore the small farmer class was death, as the Gracchi found out in the 2nd century BC. 4. As the poor grew poorer and more numerous, the already grew wealthier due to military commands, political considerations, and control of the ager publicus captured in the wars. 6. The downfall of the small farmer class made it necessary for Roman military to recruit soldiers from the urban mob and to pay for their training and upkeep, and this led to the rise of client armies. 7. There was no consistent policy for assimilating conquered Italian cities. This led to the nasty social wars of 91 to 88 BC, in which subject Italians formed the nation of Italia and fought for the right to become citizens. 8. The social wars were merely the first of 10 civil wars fought in the years between 90 BC and 31 BC, ending in the ascendancy of Augustus. 9. Individuals like Marius, Sulla, Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus were now able to ride roughshod over the Roman constitution. The struggle between wealthy individuals and democratic values had ended in a clear win for individual power. 4. Fixing the republic. 1. Be very careful who you forgive and who you trust, as Julius Caesar found out on the Ides of March. 2. Even when you have to brag endlessly about your personal accomplishments, respect the traditions of the almighty Mos Maiorum. 3. Maintain your reputation as a great military leader, while at the same time trumpeting your commitment to maintaining the peace. And 4. Pay scrupulous attention to your propaganda. It's a great big imperium out there. Different people will have different expectations of you, and as Wilt Chamberlain has thoughtfully shared with us, nobody roots for Goliath. How does Augustus Caesar pull this off? We'll find out in the next exciting